You're listening to another episode of Battles with Bits of Rubber.
I got a couple of new. I'll send the audio files when I send you this stuff, because when I was up in South Dakota last week, I got some great horse whinnies
Oh, cool.
for ringtones.
Excellent stuff.
So I'll send you some because it was pretty awesome.
That's very cool.
And I wish I'd been recording because all four of the horses that we had on the day were pretty feisty, and one of them was doing some bucking. He was just in a mood to jump around, and he's bucking and farting at the same time. And it was hilarious.
Yes, flatulent animals are
It was
a joy.
marvelous. I wish I'd been recording it.
Fantastic.
And it was very funny.
Oh my gosh. How are you today? How are things?
Good. I'm working on some burn transfer pieces. I'm probably going to have to be going up to South Dakota again, possibly next week, for another pickup day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to use my my new little cosplay smoke machine. So
cool.
we'll dress it somewhere on her body, so she'll actually be able to smolder.
That's amazing. That's so cool. It's a nice little additional sort of gag that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and it wasn't all that expensive either. The guy who makes them lives in the Netherlands.
All right. That's a neat idea.
Took a while to get over here. I could have built it myself, but I just didn't feel like taking the time. Though by the time it finally arrived here, I could have made half a dozen of them.
I just sit there with a pack of Marlboros and some tubes and just blow it under the costume. Come on.
Yeah.
She doesn't mind.
That's another way.
No, I like that.
Put that one in your bag of tricks.
Yeah. Oh well, that's that. Yeah, I was quite impressed with that little smoke machine, and it sounded very funny in the podcast as well. Yeah.
Like
awesome.
a horse farting.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, everything aches today because I've been finishing up the second bedroom floor, so that's all done now. It's just a lot of work.
How long was your walk?
Well, I kind of got a bit lost, so in the end it was about 5 hours, which I didn't mean for it to be. But yeah, I took a long walk up to where this it's a section of Atlantic wall that the Canadian Army built.
Those pictures
in 1943.
So cool. Yeah, I've heard about it.
Yeah.
But I'd never seen any pictures of it.
Oh, it's cool. It's very cool. It's up on this sort of common, which is still used by the MOD for training. But yeah, so I wanted to go there. That was fine, but it was just coming back, and then where I went back sort of through the woods to get to where I live, it's kind of all off piste. Like there's no paths or anything that's marked off, so it's a bit tricky. But it was fine. It just meant I ended up walking a lot more miles. So I've done about 20 miles today, which I didn't quite mean to do. So.
Oh God, I don't think I could walk if I'd done that.
Well, I think I will sleep well tonight. So that and the fixing of the floors, that's all done. But yeah, no, it's good. It's nice to keep busy, and I will enjoy being sat on my ass tomorrow on the computer instead. So I'll relax. Although I'll probably wake up early in the morning and have another walk. I'm trying to walk every day if I can, but just it doesn't have to be 20 miles. Jesus. Anyway, so
now
was
that
fun.
the weather's finally gotten pretty consistently nice, I'm trying to get back in the habit of getting up early again because I really like early morning. When the world is just kind of starting to wake up.
Yeah.
I think it's really my favorite time of the day.
Well, it just feels nice to get a jump on things, even if it's just to kind of have a bit of quiet time. You just feel like you've processed everything and you've kind of come online, before everybody else. It's a nice feeling. I used to love that with paper rounds.
Yeah.
You'd start a paper round early. I had no problems getting up early. I still don't. I'm an early bird. And then, yeah, you feel like, oh, cool. You've got a handle on the day before most people have, and it's a nice feeling.
Right. It's tough being married to a musician who's a real night owl because I'm a morning person and she's a late night person.
Yeah.
And trying to spend time together, I wind up getting up early and staying up late, and it wreaks havoc on the brain.
Yeah. No, that is a horrible combination. Yeah. No, I'm the same. After about 10 o'clock, I'm like, ooh, just wind down. And then when I go to bed, I'm like out like a light.
Yeah, I think I actually went to bed at like 8:30 a couple of nights ago. might have been the night I got back from South Dakota.
Yeah. I guess that was a long drive, right? So,
It is, but it's not as long as you might think. I think we did it in about 5 hours.
Okay. It's not so bad. Well, today's podcast episode, we were talking about cutting edges last time, and I think that led quite naturally to the unavoidable nerdiness that is mold closure.
Which I think is, well, for nerds are going to love it.
I think so. Well,
It's an important topic.
Well,
you can't just do squash molds and call it done.
No, exactly. I want us to be like the Joe Rogan of cutting edges and molds. Well, we'll talk like 4 hours. We might not get stoned and drink like $400 whiskey, but we'll go on at length. But we can go on at length about something very specific. But the idea of closing molds correctly and making the molds sufficiently strong enough is definitely worth talking about, because it's one of those things that people just throw information about molds and stuff and how to close them, but the finesse of how they're closed I think is quite important, and also it'd be quite interesting to talk about the differences, particularly between the States and the UK. Like, for example, mold straps. That's not really something that's massive here. It's picking up, but it's not.
I think it seems to be a more old school method of closing molds over here. I think now it's you either just squash it and clamp it, or you bolt it, or slap some weight on top of it. Yeah. But it depends, how you're going to close it. It's going to depend on what material you're putting in the mold.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're doing a pour and squash mold, because foam latex is going to be a much easier close than silicone.
Yeah.
Because silicone doesn't compress.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it depends. I mean, it's quite an abstract conversation without molds in front of us, but we'll have pictures and everything on the blog post. It's always worth noticing that there's always a blog post that goes with every episode, and some are more involved than others. But whenever there's things like this, we will always have pictures and stuff. So we got molds kicking around. We can put some pictures on there, but it seems that a lot of people do the block molds where it's like a solid block. It's like a chin or a forehead or a nose or something that's on a block. And then they mold it, and the mold is poured as another big block. So you have these two big blocks of resin or plaster. And so those are quite easily squished together. The complications come when you're doing something much larger, like a full chest or a whole body or something, or even just an arm. You're not going to pour that as a solid block because it's just impractical. So you end up making those out of like fiberglass or epoxy, where they're more like a shell. They're rigid shells. And then they would get bolted together. So it's a different kind of thing, isn't it?
Right.
So, so in my experience, most people that have done a few molds, they tend to do small molds, and they tend to be block molds, so they can get their head around what a clamp might do or a strap. But you wouldn't necessarily need to bolt. So I guess the question is, how do you know what kind of closure to use for the mold?
Yeah, and also how you're gonna be filling it, because you can do a block mold that has an open orifice on one end or one side. To do a
matron
to do a pour fill. We've devolved already.
Sorry.
Like I'm getting ready to do. I'm gonna make a mold of this little guy.
Oh, sweet. Well, that's cool.
This is that gargoyle I told you about.
Yeah.
The only real problem area potentially, I think, are the little. You can't really see these little.
Oh, the tip of the beard.
Little chin hairs.
Yeah.
Are sticking out, and the tail is doing a little bit of a curl down. So that's a potential air bubble point, because if you fill it through the base, that gets to be a problem, and so do these little hairs.
Yeah. Are you happy to put a couple of pictures of that up on the
Sure.
on the notes, or that's not a secret thing?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't believe it is.
That'd be great, because that's a
And what
good
I did,
example of mold,
I
trickiness.
printed out a 4-inch by 4-inch cylinder that's 3 millimeters thick that I'm gonna hot glue it down onto a board, put this guy down inside it, and fill it up with silicone.
Amazing. That's perfect. Isn't that neat? You can just print
And
out
I'm
what
gonna-
you need. I love
Yeah.
that. I'd never get
And
bored of
and I'll just release the shit out of it so I can push it out. And
Yeah.
I'll probably do a thin layer of Vaseline, petroleum jelly on the inside of it so I can easily slide it out, and then I will just cut the piece
Nice.
out of. I'm going to use really soft. I'm going to use a 10 shore silicone for the mold,
Mhm.
and I've got three. I got three different types of silicone, or 3 different silicones, 2 platinums and 1 tin. And I'm going to see which one I like the best, and they're all sufficiently long working time that I can degas them.
Nice.
So then I'm going to try doing a pressure cast test, because that may push the resin material up into that tail tip
Mhm.
and into the points
Cool.
after I slosh it around in there good.
Is that the original sculpt you just held up?
Yeah, it is.
Right, okay.
It's a piece that a client sent to me.
Nice.
Pretty sweet
Yeah.
little piece. It looks kind of like a Japanese oni demon.
Yeah, you said. Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely got that vibe going on about it. God, that'd look amazing. It's 8 feet tall. Have one either side of your front
Right.
door.
That the wings could spread out.
Yeah. Or you could have them that you winch them and they come out like an umbrella for the garden or something for the summer. Yeah, they're quite. That's a fiddly little piece, but that's a very good example of whole mold making. How thought comes into how you're going to mold it and the angle you're going to pour it at and where your risers have got to be and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So with mold closure, what's your favorite preferred way? So if you've got a block mold, so like a half face or something, and it's just a block, and how are you clamping that? Are you molding it? You're jumping up and down on it? How are you gonna?
I'll clamp it. I'll clamp it together, and then I'll pour in the hole
Mhm.
that I can fit a little funnel spout in the fill end, and then just pop it open when it's done. I'll make sure that I have pry points in it, because if you don't, even for a block mold, if you just have that fine seam all the way around with nothing to stick in to pry it apart,
Mhm.
it's going to be a hell of a demold, because suction is no longer your friend.
No, that's not good. Yeah, and having the core slightly higher than the mold, like you say, to get that in. And then what kind of clamps do you have? Do you have like those quick clamps that you squeeze, or are they the twisty turny ones?
I have both. I have C clamps. I use the C clamps primarily for demolding with the crossbars.
Yes.
And the Rob Freitas method. But I have the squeeze clamps that I use mostly for foam latex, because foam 2-piece molds are much easier to press and get good compression on it, because it's mostly air.
Mhm.
Whereas silicone doesn't have the same amount of give, so I can clamp it to hold it in place while I get nut and bolt action happening on it and get it down real tight.
Mhm.
But you got to make sure that when you're doing your flashing, you don't just put flashing around the sculpt and leave no way for excess to escape.
Yeah.
Because if you have more material than you have volume of your flashing, you're never going to get the mold closed.
Yeah.
Or you're going to have a real spewy mess somehow, because that excess material has to be able to escape.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, because like you say, when you fill up the mold first and then you squish your core into it, you get that massive overflow that goes everywhere.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a problem, because it's all over the gloves and the bolt holes and everything, and just trying to do up bolts that are covered in silicone is a nightmare, because it's just slippy, slidey,
Mm-hmm.
horrible, and then you're holding your glove if you're using like a power drill to tighten them up, everything's slippy, slidey, and then you get your thumb trapped between the nut and I've had that before. It's a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, and it can be a nightmare then demolding, because you've got set silicone completely engulfing your bolts and your nuts, and there's a chance that it catches and yanks on something it shouldn't be yanking on, so you have to be real careful in unscrewing that stuff.
That entire
Gee.
passage I'm going to cut and put at the beginning of the podcast because that's fucking perfect. I know exactly what you mean, though. It's one of the things. The only problem I've got with that molds where you spray the cat plastic and you put them together and then bolt them up is the fear of, the spinning nut catching some of the cat plastic and you end up, running your piece only to discover you pull the entire thing off like a tablecloth.
And it always does. No matter how careful you are, it catches on something.
It's tricky. Well, what I do now, if it's like a really important thing, I'll cat plastic everything. I'll leave the cat plastic for a couple of hours so it kind of firms up, and then I'll go in with tweezers. I'll lift the cat plastic around the keys and all the touchdowns, and then melt them off with acetone. It's a real pain in the arse, but it does make a difference, and it just means the mold closes that much tighter because the thickness of the cat plastic is then removed. But it also takes away the chance of you catching it.
If you put a little petroleum jelly around the threads of the bolt, that will also help alleviate the problem.
Yeah, I guess that wouldn't it? Because then they're lubricate or released in advance, so they'll spin better, and also the silicone will kind of come off. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good one. And then so there's bolts, there's the clamps. The issue with clamps, and I'll do some, or I have done some illustrations to sort of show this, but you get the point where you have to worry about the depth of the throat of the clamp.
Yep.
Because obviously, ideally, what you want to do is get the clamp in the middle. Well, my take on it is I think you need to get the clamp in the center of the mold. Because my fear is that if you put like 2 or 3 clamps around the edge, you might tighten one clamp more than the other, and then you've actually got a lift on one side, or you're putting uneven amounts of pressure. Whereas a single clamp in the middle is more likely to provide you with even closure. But if the mold is 10 inches wide, and that means the center to the edge of the mold is 5 inches, but your clamp only has a 4-inch throat, you can't get that clamp in the middle.
Yeah, and finding those...
I'm sorry to say, you need a deeper throated clamp. I'm sorry to say.
And finding those kind of clamps are more of a specialty item, and if you can even find them, they can get quite costly.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of those, and they are magnificent, and they you can put a lot of pressure on them. But,
which is also what you need, because the squeeze clamps, sometimes you just can't squeeze them tight enough to get the closure that you could with a C clamp, where you're ratcheting down on a threaded device, and you can get it really tight.
Also, and they're made out of pressed steel as well, so they tend to kink and warp under pressure, especially if you're like angry trying to get that mold closed. You draw on the spirits of your elders and long gone relatives, and they come into the strength of your hands, and you end up bending this bloody thing.
Well, something I've had happen is because they also have these little rubber feet stuck on the ends, and if the flange that you're clamping isn't perfectly horizontal, you run the risk of clamping it down tight, and either the top or the bottom one slides off, that little rubber foot shoots off, and you can't get it to clamp. Yeah.
Or heaven forbid you find you've got tapered edges to your mold. Say you're clamping the edges and you find there isn't a grip. You actually need to be almost more than horizontal. You almost need it to be angled so that it's encouraged inwards. That would probably be a good drawing to do, actually. Yeah, horrendous. That's terrifying. So the clamps work. The weights work. The weights are nice and easy, but the trouble with the weights is they're heavy when they're not being used. So,
and also
that's a commitment.
The surface that they're putting the weights on has to be level also, or you run the risk of the weights sliding onto the floor, onto your toes, onto your fingers.
Yeah, that's no fun. And the weight you need a serious amount of weight. I mean, a good clamp will easily be able to put like 100, 200 pounds of pressure on something.
Oh, I even stand on some of my epoxy molds for foam latex to get good closure. I'll stand on those guys, and you don't, for foam latex, I've found that you don't even really have to. I mean, it's always a good idea to get it clamped shut somehow, but foam, because of the way foam latex works, you're squashing the air. Once you've got it pushed all the way down in, it's not going to lift back up again the way silicone can. So you press the positive into the negative with silicone. You've got to make sure that it is held firmly But foam latex, once it's squashed, it's going to stay squashed.
Do you think that I'm of the opinion that plaster is used more commonly, certainly with foam, but it was used more commonly because your gypsum there is just much better.
You need it's beneficial to have gypsum molds for foam latex so that the moisture can be absorbed into the stone. It just helps with the curing and the vulcanization process. But epoxy works really just fine. I have very few stone molds that I use for foam anymore. It's pretty much all epoxy molds.
Because we used a lot of foam
and they're
latex.
Just so much lighter.
Yeah, oh god, yeah, and just nicer as well. They're just much nicer to handle. But we've used a lot of and I always get joy when people are like, "Why you put foam latex in fiberglass molds and bake them in the oven?" I'm like, "Yeah, all the time," because they don't weigh much, there's a couple of benefits. The other thing is they cook quick because the molds are thin. I mean, fiberglass molds are only about 3 mil thick.
Yeah, it doesn't take long to heat that up.
No, and you can jump up and down on that; it wouldn't break. But they need to be bolted because they're so thin. They will flex and distort, so they will soften a little bit in the mold as well, in the oven as well. So if you open them while they're still hot, they can distort when they cool. But the beauty is if you know the 2-part mold and the core are all bolted together, if there's any movement, they move slightly together and cool down together. Mm-hmm. And so they'll cook nice and quick in an oven.
And then you need to have, because of the thinness, it's a good idea to also have bolts somewhere, like you were talking about with the clamp in the middle of the mold. You want to be able to bolt it in the middle, someplace where it's not gonna affect the piece you're making, whether it's through the nose or through the eyeballs or through the lips.
Yeah, these little touchdowns in the middle, and and they are. I mean, it depends again on how you're going to do it, because you can bolt them all together and inject it, which is how I used to like to do that. But the other way of doing it would be to brush in your foam latex, and then pour it, squish it in, close it up, and then you got to bolt that mold together before it gels, which is a terrifying feeling if there's a lot of molds to do. But that's how it's stuff like that really gives you your edge, because you're scared, and so you adjust your mixtures accordingly, and it does give you put some steam in your strides. But and for those, I think bolting down was good. And I remember unbolting a mold that could have at least, a full body mold, maybe 50-60 bolts at least. Each bolt was about 2-3 inches apart and quite close to the the sculpt. There was quite a regimented way of doing things, to make sure they were consistent. And obviously you might, for some areas where the seams are really important, you might have more bolts. Say you had a headpiece with a seam down the middle, and you knew from the ears up to the top of the head was all under hair, so you might not have as many bolts. But with one thing I did like about the bolt method, especially with foam latex, is you could do them up kinda, but not fully tight, right, and then inject the foam. It would piss out through the cutting edge, and then you just had to tighten them up. And then that was really nice, because that took the pressure out of you having to locate and do up every bolt. Because if we get some of the really long bolts, like 2-inch long bolts, you'd have to tighten them up, for 1 3/4 inches before it bit. Right. And that was a real pain in the ass. And this was the old Makita electric drills with the long 9-volt batteries, and they were heavy and they weren't balanced at all. That was fun.
Well, I've got a few pictures in the 3rd edition of my book that we can repurpose for this also, that are some mold closures. Cool. Because a little trick I learned from Landon Meyer is using magnets. And you could also use a zipper.
Tell me more.
For doing, if you're doing a full head life cast in one piece, what you can do is you can actually, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that for a life cast, because you don't want to inconvenience your talent any more than possible. But if you're doing a full head piece, when you're doing the sculpt, and you want to do it all in one piece, and then cut the core open so that it can, after you got the shell and you want to make sure that it seats properly again, you can do a zipper up the back reinforced with some fabric along the edges so that it won't tear, particularly at the zenith of the zipper where it is fully open, so that it doesn't tear where you don't want it to. And you just have to cover it as you're adding your layers to it to make sure that you don't lock the teeth together. But it gets a real nice closure, and we'll have pictures that we can show that will make it all really clear. But magnets also work really well. After you've got your brush up, or however you're doing your one piece silicone core, glue the little tiny neodymium magnets that are wicked powerful, but they're really small. You can get little spheres or rectangles or cylinders, whatever floats your boat, to put them together. Lock the two pieces together, and then with thickened silicone, like Silpoxy or something that sets up pretty quickly, position those all the way around where your cut line's going to be, every 2 or 3 inches as you go. And then when you cut it apart, the magnets stay on each half, and they force the pieces back into registration.
Nice.
Because the magnet holds it perfectly, so there's very little seaming that you have to do. And the magnets work really well.
Would you need to secure them to some fabric to make sure that they don't just pull out of the
You
silicone?
certainly could. Yeah.
I think that would be good. I mean, if they're that strong, they could probably be behind the fabric, and that way they wouldn't actually break through at all. Oh, I like that. And then you prep those in advance, then you just pop them in and then spooge your silicone around the outside. Sweet. I like that. Yeah, nice and clean. Yeah, that's interesting. I remember seeing I don't know if he came up with it or if he'd seen someone do it, but Brian Best had done something with a mold where he wanted to, I don't know if it was a head. He'll know because he'll probably have the notes on it. I'll have to ask him, but he'd made a mold of something. It was a brush up, and then I think it was a pour, I beg your pardon. And then he would set like little rods in on the keys, on some of the keys, and then pour the mold around it. And then that way the silicone went around these rods, so that when you assembled the mold, you could poke the rods in, and then you knew that the keys were located correctly, but also they wouldn't fall out. And that was a really neat
I've
trick.
done something similar that Dave Parvin showed me, where you can actually do that with nails.
Right.
You can lay them in and silicone over there, so that once the silicone sets and you cut it apart, you put it back together, and then you slide the nail back through the hole, and that forces registration.
This is cool. I want to get onto the whole the plastic shim business, but that's we may get off on one. That is not podcasty stuff. That needs video, because that did my head in for the longest time. How you would use the plastic shim. It's fantastic, and it works really well.
We'll do a video.
Yeah, I think we'll have to do a video on that. I've got some plastic shim, I think, in the workshop. So you got your clamps, your weights, the straps. Now, with the straps, I had a hell of a time trying to think what they were called. I got in touch with Rob because I was bugging him, because Kazoo wanted these particular molds, and they were the mold straps. And as far as I'm aware, that's what they're called. They're just called mold straps, or banding straps, I think, is another word.
Yeah, I've got gigantic rubber bands that work as mold straps, and then I've got a bunch of different. They come in different lengths because molds come in different sizes. But it's almost like a belt, like one of these military belts, but you put it through, get it fairly tight, and then it's a type of closure, and I can't think of the name of it, but you push it back down and it clicks.
Yes.
And it
holds
in place just because of the pressure. It's not actually snapping into anything, but it's the pressure of closing it 180 degrees.
And there's a bit of leverage on there. And so, you pull it tight, like you say, by hand, and then it gives you that extra half inch. And that's really where the pressure comes in. But it's not crazy amounts of pressure that you're likely to break the mold. That's what's good about those. Because I've used something similar with the ratchet straps, which have, you pull them tight. as hard as you can, and then you have like a lever that you clamp and you ratchet until you get the tension you want. But those can be like stupid strong and could actually break your mold, because they're, I guess with a good mold, and depending how viscous your silicone is, you shouldn't need a massive amount of pressure for the two faces to meet correctly. And that, I guess, it's very easy to go crazy and put too much pressure on in the belief it'll give you a better edge, but actually it might start just eroding the integrity of your mold.
And one thing you can do, and I think you mentioned it when we were prepping for this, is you put a piece of wood on top of it that basically lifts it up a little, because otherwise the strap's kind of going straight across and you're only getting pressure right at the contact edges of the core. And if you put a piece of wood on it, like a chunk of 2x4 or something like that, you're putting more pressure evenly across the entire face of the core. And and I think you can even pull it a little bit tighter doing that without risking damage to the mold. Whereas if you left it using a ratchet mold, for example, a ratchet strap, for example, if you didn't have the piece of wood and you ratchet down real tight, you might crack the mold. But if you've got a piece of wood and you ratchet down with the same amount of pressure, it's not going to break.
Yeah. I guess what you could do, if you had like 3 or 4 molds on the go, if you've got weights or something heavy, you could fill them all up, put the cores in, and then put the weight on just to kind of give that constant pressure, and then go around to your first one, put the strap on, and then you can strap them all. And then by the time you get to the end one, if your silicone started to cure and it's getting a little bit thicker, the fact that it's been under a weight, even if it's not a particularly heavy one, it's been under enough constant pressure that it's slowly closed up tight. It's going to be more effective with that strap. Because I've done a nice illustration of those straps from the side, and we'll have to look at. I'll take some photos of my ratchet straps because they're really nice. And there's also one with the cam on it. Like it's just like got teeth on one side. You pull it tight. It's more of a luggage strap, really, but it does work. And then I guess what you could do is, once that's closed, you could put a couple of wedges underneath and hit them together to create the tension afterwards. But I don't think that would be particularly effective. But that's a way of doing it. I like the idea with the rubber bands, because they're a bit more forgiving as well, I suppose. Especially for foam latex or like a...
They're pretty good.
Nice and easy. Yeah.
Or for
pressure as well.
Simple block molds. If you've got a plaster block mold, the rubber bands work great.
Yeah. And then obviously the thing is, once you've got your mold closed up, and then it's cured or baked or done whatever you want to do, then you've got the problem of then getting it out, and that's a consideration. You've got to make the mold strong enough to withstand that, and that's one of the things I think people perhaps don't take into account is how much pressure you'll put on a mold trying to open it sometimes, and you'll find bits chip off or it cracks because you're putting a thin screwdriver in, and the leverage you're
it's a lot of force in a very small area.
It is, yeah, and it's worth probably using a wider tool like a pry bar rather than a thin screwdriver, because then it's sort of spread slightly over a wider edge. And also, like you're saying about having a wedge in there, like some kind of an area to put in a screwdriver, so it's actually wide enough to accommodate the width of the tool you're going to use.
And not to be in a hurry trying to get the thing open, because particularly with silicone, it creates its own suction against the positive and the negative. And if you apply pressure a little bit at a time, it will gradually release itself. You'll hear this. Hear this. And it'll just pop open.
Yeah. It's tricky, isn't it? Because the silicone is, especially if they're very soft silicones, they give, they stretch, they move with the mold. So you might have, moved it a half inch up, but it's still not coming out because the air hasn't managed to break that
and
seal.
then you run the risk of tearing the piece if you try to get a little overexcited and force it to come out.
Yeah.
Part of it's might stick to the positive and part of it might stick to the negative, and comes out in 2 pieces when it's only supposed to be 1.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the other reasons I think it's worth sometimes making a mold in more pieces than you think, because it makes getting it out easier. Because, you know, the consequence of having multiple piece mold is you end up with seam lines, but maybe having some seams that you need to fix afterwards is less of a hassle than a mold that's completely fucked because you couldn't be asked making one more piece to that mold. You know what I mean? So it's, again, I keep praising him for that, but Brian was very good at that. He would often, even though it was more work to do it, he would make molds with extra pieces because he could see that if that front half of the face was in one piece, it would just be, you know, it would put so much pressure on, it would break. And then, you know, so he'd much rather put maybe a seam down the back, and then the front edge could be crept slightly more forward, and it just made a big difference to how you get things out. I remember as well, David White had this trick. We were making a mold, and we wanted the seam line to be quite far back. So what he ended up having us do was fill the ears first, up to where the tragus was. So you do the head on the side, fill the ears, and then put bolts into them, and then mold the rest of the head. So that, you know, when you're trying to pull the front mold off, normally the bit that goes into the ear would just rip through. But that was a separate piece, so that was held with a magnet or a bolt, I think. And then you unscrew the bolts, pull the face off, and then you pull the bits of the ear out afterwards.
Yeah, I think Neil
snap back in. And
Neil
that was a neat
did
trick.
a demo of a mold similar to that, where there was something else in the ear. I can't recall exactly. I might even have pictures of it somewhere. That had another little piece that kind of protected the ears.
It's just a small thing, but when you think about how deep the ear holes are, unless they're going to be suspiciously shallow, they can be a real pain, and, you know, they end up dragging through. And anyone that's made a mold, you'll know when you come to clean it out, one of the things you'll do is when you open it is look at the damage to the clay head once you've pulled the mold off, to see where things are dragging and digging and whether they're going to be critical on a silicone piece or not. And sometimes, you know, you kind of go, oh, do you know what? I made the mold in a day because I only did it in 2 pieces, but now I wish I'd done a third piece, because it's clearly going to rip that corner of the ear off every time I do it, and it's going to be more work than just making that mold one time properly.
Well, apologies to anybody listening to this if what we're talking about sounds like we're speaking Swahili or Martian, but if you see pictures in the show notes along with listening to it, we hope it makes a lot more sense. Because it took us a while,
just get in touch
to get all this sorted out, and you just kind of have to do it and study the work of masters like Rob Freitas and Carl Lyon and Brian Best to see a beautifully made mold, and you go, oh
yes,
that boom, then you get those light bulb moments.
Yeah. Do you know, it's one of those things with the mold room, you know, working in the mold room for a lot. It was one of those departments that was never really, I don't want to sound whiny about it, was never appreciated. You know, it was never, probably because it was smelly and it wasn't the sort of room that you'd pop into, whereas people would pop in to see, and they walked past the sculpts. You didn't just pop into the mold room. So there was a lot that went on, a lot of thought that went into things that was never really considered, and it was quite nice. I think I'm trying to think when it was. I think it was one of whenever it was that it snowed in the London IMATs.
Oh yeah, that was
that year or the year before
2009, 2008,
I think it was when Tom Savini was there.
It had to be 2008.
Tom Savini.
Oh no, there was another. It snowed in 2008 or 9. But then there was one where it was really bad. I didn't make it to that show, and that's when they decided to swap the LA and the London show.
Right, because I think it was the snow that made them scared to do it in January again, so they moved it to the June date. But I think it was that one, or maybe the one before that Rob Freitas came to speak about molds, and it was kind of like the first time I'd seen someone who knew about that stuff that was being listened to. I was like, yes, finally someone from the mold room is speaking, and they're listening to him. They're listening to the shit that goes on. I remember coming out of I won't say what movie it was, but fucking hell, I remember once we came out from the mold room, and nobody was in the workshop. Everyone had gone. We didn't know where anybody had gone, and where they'd gone is they'd gone to watch rushes of the previous day's filming. And no one came in to say, do you guys want to see the rushes? It was that kind of shit. Do you know what I mean? You just felt like
guys,
fucking.
They don't need to see.
Never mind.
Stuff.
Don't mind me.
I don't know who said it. It
It's like,
might have been Rob Freitas, but you probably heard this before too. That good molds aren't made; they're designed
exactly. And then made.
and then made.
But yeah, so yeah, that kind of thing was yeah, that did piss me off. So it was lovely to see that, and it's happening more now where you get like, you know, hashtag mold porn, which is, you know, nice to see, where, you know, just ridiculous levels of skill involved in claying up and making unnecessarily beautiful molds.
Yeah, particularly
I like to see
the
that.
collapsible core puzzle molds that are many pieces, and you know, the thought that goes into creating that is still blows me away. I look at it and go, all right, I'm still not sure exactly how that works.
Yeah, how it works, or how you came up with this.
Yeah.
Like, you have to sell your soul to the devil to be able to figure this out.
My brain doesn't work that way.
And you know, all the can in the world doesn't help, really. You still got to go and make it that way. There we go. And then just touching back onto that mold closure thing, one thing I forgot to mention was is considering whether there's heat involved in curing the casting material, because like foam latex, you know, it starts off room temperature or cold, and then, you know, then you put it in an oven and gradually warm it up. So things like, you know, warping if the mold is open too quickly, or, you know, you might put a mold together and you may put like a bunch of steel clamps on it, then put that in the oven. There's a danger, there's a danger if you tighten everything up as much as you can, then it goes in the oven and everything expands. The mold expands and the clamps expand, and then the clamping, the expansion of the clamp might be such that it crushes down on the expanding mold, and then you end up with it damaging. It may not be damaged
like hairline
visibly,
cracks
but it could be
created that you won't see, but
exactly
repeated use just will increase that damage further and further until the point comes where it just breaks and you go, what the fuck happened? How?
Yeah.
And then your mold is fucked, and you need to run 6 more pieces of that, and you don't have a mold to do it.
No,
and you didn't make a master.
No. That's a scary prospect. We don't really have that level of plaster mold making skill really over here, because people don't use it. I know across the board epoxy and all the doughs and everything get used far more, but there's definitely, I remember seeing, like, do you remember the Caglione and Drexler Effects Lab in Gorza?
Yeah.
And there was this beautiful, I'm trying to think which, I will dig it out and find it, because I've decided I need to know now. But there's a bit where they do a whole thing on plaster, and they build like the Tower of Babel out of plaster, but it's the same batch, and the idea is to show you how you know, if you keep piling it on when you first mix it, it just spreads like melted ice cream across the table, and if you leave it too long, it's set hard and you can't do anything with it. So he would stay, you know, they would dump it on there and then add a little bit, so it would get higher and higher with the same batch as it started to set up, so that by the time you got to the top and the competition, you know, I think Jeff Porter used to do this as well at LCF, London College of Fashion. When he taught there, he'd try and build a tower of plaster, and everyone would try and build the tallest tower out of the same batch of plaster. Do you know what I mean? So it really taught you the process of how plaster sets up before you're finding this out on a mold, you know, and it's a good thing to kind of get used to. It is a neat trick. But we don't there is some plaster molding, but not nearly as much as I've seen in the States, where you see these beautifully crafted UltraCal 30 molds that just, they look like something out of the 50s. They look like the nose of a 50s hot rod or something, you know. They're all smooth and chunky. And how would those be closed? Would they be closed up with straps, I guess?
I think straps. I've seen them closed up with weight. It depends what you're casting into it.
Yeah. Because the thing is, if you're going to use straps, you kind of want everything rounded off and smooth so nothing digs in. Whereas with clamps, you need parallel surfaces, and you need areas that are flat, and they need to be big enough to accommodate the clamp, but they also need to be thick enough so they're strong enough to withstand being pried open with a screwdriver. So there's quite a lot of demand on.
And you also need to, because the mold is sitting flat on a table or whatever surface you're you're using to fill the mold. If you're using straps, you need to have some device, a couple of boards or something underneath the mold that'll allow you to get the straps underneath so you can get it around the mold. Otherwise, it becomes kind of a clusterfuck that you're tilting it this way to get the strap on, and then you're tilting it the other way to get the other end on, because one strap usually isn't sufficient. You need to have two straps, or maybe even three, depending on the size of the mold. So you go middle, top, and bottom, and you've got to be able to get those straps underneath the mold so you can get them up and close it. Yeah. And you can either design that right into the mold so that it becomes part of the negative, or you've got to have something that same size so it's sitting level. You don't want to have a piece of 2x4 and a piece of 1x, because mold doesn't sit right.
Yeah. So that's the point, isn't it? Like you say about designing a mold, actually accommodating into the way the mold is built things that would assist or at least not inhibit closure and opening, and silly things like you put your strap over it and it's nice and tight, and then you realize the strap is obscuring where the injection tube is, or something stupid like that, and you're like, oh Christ. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Gee, how do I know about that?
Because you done it.
Yep.
Oh, actually, we got some a couple of nice messages which we should put together on our next episode. I put them all together in a folder, but I haven't really had time to write around them and include them in the thing. So we'll do them on the next one. But it's funny when other people have done the same thing, like screw things up in a workshop, and it's just, we're going to get a few more of those. I mean, I remember one of my screw ups. I think I mentioned it before. I had a mold, and I mixed up this massive Hobart full of foam, like a big mixer, like 18 inches across diameter and 2 feet deep. This massive tub full of foam latex, and then flipped the mold upside down, and only to find there was no injection point. I'd forgotten to do it as well.
Oh no.
So that kind of thing. But you learn. I was just in a lot of pressure, and I had to get stuff done, and it's just one of those things I stupidly didn't think about. There we go.
Yeah, I've had some wonderful silicone mishaps.
It's tricky. Yeah. Have you had silicone cure on you before you get it in?
No,
I
haven't had that happen. I've had foam latex gel in mid pour.
Oh, that's a fucking nightmare. That's such a nightmare, because you've got to take it down. See, but this is the thing with silicone, right? You've got the cap plastic element. So, like, if you screw that up, even if, say, you pour it and you half fill the mold, okay, you've got to open it up. It's foam latex. But if it's silicone, you've also got to then redo all your release agents and then spray your cap plastic again. And that's just such a ball ache.
Yeah.
I think it's less likely to happen because silicone is easier in that. As per our Batman and Robin memes of many times, where poor old Robin's getting slapped because he thinks. You've got, your silicon, you're pretty confident how quickly your silicon is going to set up, or if it's going to be shit, it's going to be shit, so you retard it or you put it in the fridge. But with foam, it really is like, pissing into the wind.
Yeah,
you can do the best you can, but you really are at the mercy of the gods.
Yeah, temperature and humidity will wreak havoc with your foam run. Yeah, it was like watching a cartoon, because it's pouring it into the mold and just kind of went and just stopped. Never, just in midair, it gelled.
Yeah. And you're like, get a photo of this, but no one's in that frame of mind at that time. Especially if it's like 3 in the morning or something.
Those are profanity-inducing moments.
Yes, they are.
We talked about stuff where I doing a simple block mold of a 3D printed part, and you spot hot glue it down onto the board, thinking that's going to be enough. Oh, the silicone seeps. Silicone will find a way to get underneath anything.
Separate them.
Yeah. And you pour the silicone in there, and you think it's going to be great. And you come back in 5 minutes later, and the part's floating on top of the silicone. And it's like, fuck me. now what? Because
I think I have to press it down
yeah.
and hold it for 12 hours with my
it's
finger.
it's possible that as the silicone's starting to get a little thicker, you may be able to push it down, and the suction created by the base and the bottom of the part might be enough to hold it down, but probably not. So you've got to get a little piece of piano wire or something to try to force it down, and you wind up getting silicones all over everything. And it depends how badly do you have to get this thing done. Or you're just going to say, all right, I'm just going to eat this one and let it go off, peel all the silicone off, and use cyanoacrylate and glue that fucker down on the board and try it again.
Fuck it, yeah. That mold, that 3D print is fucked, but that's what you get. That's what you get. I got a mold, it's fine. It's like a sculpt, it's going to get trashed. But oh my gosh, that's it. Did you say you were to do a head in like epoxy? So you've got like an epoxy layer, and maybe you do either ultracal, or you might do the freeform air or something, so that the mold itself is maybe 3/4 of an inch thick.
Yeah.
How would you close that up if that was like a full head? Would you have bolts going around the outside?
So it's a full head, solid head core, and then a 2-part negative.
Yeah. So maybe down to the shoulders.
Yeah,
I would
head. Probably do. Well, I might do it in 3 pieces.
Yes.
So I'd have a seam line up the back and then 2 up the side, and just make sure that I don't have an undercut, so that I won't be able to get the front piece off, because if it starts curving around, the back gets past that midline of the curve, then you've basically locked the core and the front half of the mold together.
Not good.
But I'll do it in 3 pieces, where and a flange in the back and down the sides, and then I'll bolt it.
Because I think that's how I would do it. But what I found with epoxies, especially the sort of the doughs, is that you end up with a much more rigid mold. They're much more accurate, so you can get away with fewer bolt holes. But because the mold material itself is that much thicker, you're going to need bigger molds, bigger bolts. Like with a fiberglass mold, the 20 millimeter or the 25 millimeter, threaded portion of an M6 bolt is usually plenty, unless it's going through some obscure angle. But if you're doing something that's, maybe 3/4 or an inch thick, you actually need the bolts to be 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick, which means, it takes longer to do them up. But if you've only got 5, it doesn't matter, instead of, 50.
Yeah, you can do a lot fewer bolts.
Yeah, that's very cool. Or in a real hurry, I guess you could put a couple of clamps on it, make it clampable, so the molds are nice and level. The mold walls are parallel and big enough to accommodate a clamp, so you can clamp it quickly, especially if you're doing something like polyfoam or something. And then you go around with your bolts and add your bolts afterwards to make it really secure. But that initial closure is, initiated with the clamps.
Just with clamps.
Yeah.
Yep. I've done it that way as well.
Cool. And then when you come to open it up, you got that pry point. Do you ever have? I've done it.
You just have to be patient.
But do you lever the edge?
And you
make them nice and strong, the flange really strong to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely do that. And I'll try to. I'll pry it open and get I do both sides at the same time, so that I'm not applying undue pressure at just one point, increasing the torque at one point, because that's when you run the risk of cracking something. But I'll try both sides, and I'll get it open just enough that I can get a tongue depressor, a wooden tongue depressor in it, and I'll do that all the way around, and I'll get the little wooden sticks all the way around, and then I'll pry it up a little bit more so that I can have 2 sticks in. And once I've got 2 sticks in, I can take a third in between the 2 of those and just kind of tap it in there and gradually start separating the mold.
Yeah.
And then those 2 back pieces come off real easily. It's still going to be a real bitch to get the the one piece off the front, particularly
Yes.
if it's, you know, half the face. If you go cheat it a little bit forward, so your seam line's a little bit farther forward, might make it a little easier for you, but then you run the risk of having a seam line in some place that you don't want to have to deal with a seam line. Then you just gotta hope that the mold gods are on your side trying to get that front piece off, because that can be a real sweat inducing exercise workout. Yeah.
Yeah, and until you got one out, you ain't got one out. It's a scary thought. One thing I have done for some things, and it worked well for like larger molds, would be you'd build into them, you know, big strong handles that you'd, especially with fiberglass, you know, you'd plot over those with laser fiberglass so that there were handles embedded in it. And then there was a couple of molds where I had it. We did it on Dracula as well. And then what I would do is I'd have the front and the back like that. So I have these big strong handles well plastered into the mold itself. And then I would get 2 bits of wood and slide it through front and back, you know, that might have 6 feet long pieces of timber. And then you could use them like you know,
levers.
Yeah, and you gently part them apart. So rather than actually prying a point on the thing, you'd actually flex it out.
Yeah.
And I did that, I think, because they were plaster molds and they weren't really going to be used a lot, but we were going to use them more than once. And I just figured every time I go in there with a screwdriver, I'm putting a single point on. And again, because our plaster's not that great, it worked all right, but because our plaster's not that great, I didn't want to stress it out that much.
What do you use to reinforce the plaster? Are you using hemp fibers or burlap?
We use the burlap, which is the scrim stuff. So it's like, you know, 1/4-inch holes of the Hessian scrim. And old school plasterers, when we were taught at college, we had an old school plasterer called Kenny Clark. He'd worked on the original Star Wars trilogy, and he was like a fibrous plasterer, worked on set. And he showed us how to soak the scrim first. So we'd soak all our scrim and wring it out before we added the plaster to it.
Yeah, then it's going to get a better bite.
Exactly, and it didn't rob any of the moisture out of your plaster, which was great, and then keeping it wet and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we have some decent plaster, like Cristacal R is our sort of
It's kind of like our hydrocal.
Well,
it's really
it probably
hard.
Is it is. It's not as good as Ultracal by a long shot.
No,
but it's okay. But we have one called Alpha K, which is really hard, which I suspect is probably similar in strength to Ultracal 30. However, you can't build up with it. It's just, it stays really liquidy until it sets. There's no like cheesy stage where you can build with it. It's a very odd, like you can build it up a bit and then as soon as you agitate it, it just kind of flumps down. So it's good for small flood molds, but yeah, you can't build with that. So I think that's probably why we ended up that, and the fact we're an island, so we have a lot of shipbuilding, or did have a lot of shipbuilding, and boats were a big deal. So there was plenty of resin and fiberglassing and all that kind of stuff. So because of the combination of the ship plaster we had, because of our relatively small geology and capacious amounts of coastline, I think we ended up doing everything in fiberglass. So I came into an industry that was well versed with fiberglass, and I'd look and see these beautiful molds in Gore Zone, and they were all, you know, full head plasters, and it was like, wow, they look so nice, you know, all these plaster molds. And we don't really make them in the same way.
Well, it's interesting how the craft has developed in different places, because, you know, our fiberglass resins, from what I understand, are nothing compared to the stuff that you get.
I wonder why is it still the same?
Ours are inferior. I don't know. I think so. No, anybody listening knows different. Let us know. But I've heard that, you know, I am of the understanding that fiberglass polyester resins that are available in the UK are superior to what's available in the US.
It's amazing, because I think a lot of people maybe haven't used it, because it is quite tricky to use, and I hear like horror stories of people saying, oh, you know, you can't get the detail with it, or they had to, you know, thicken their resin to make a gel coat. And like, we just buy it. It's ready made. There's gel coat pre-accelerated. You just add your catalyst, and then it works. Especially Scott Barder, I love that stuff. And then you lay out resin and it just works. And you don't have to make it. You don't have to. It's just a product that exists. But I suspect that's, like I say, because of the amount of, the rain we have here, which means a lot more roofing, fiberglassing, and all that kind of stuff, and the boat building industry. But yeah, I think the good thing about epoxy is you're seeing that happening on both sides. And the good thing about epoxy is, I mean, there's still fumes. You still manage the fumes, but it doesn't stink. Like people 5 buildings away are not going to say, "What's that smell?" Which they did with polyester, for weeks afterwards. So.
And it's not as
it's not
flammable.
Yeah, it's not, and you can kind of wash things with water with it, which is quite nice, and smoothing things down is nice. I do like how polyester resin breaks down the glass. You get a beautiful finish with it.
And that's the one thing epoxy doesn't. I still use the same material to reinforce it, but it doesn't become one with the epoxy. Whereas with polyester, it literally melts the chopped glass and the sheeting, and that's why it's so strong.
But I think that the halfway house is to use an epoxy gel coat and then something like freeform air, which you can then kind of use to fill in all the bits are going to be hard to navigate to create a much smoother, streamlined shape. Even if it means, it's a bit thicker in some places just to make it a smoother shape, and you've got this rounded off kind of like melted smooth shape, and then you just put a couple of layers of glass over that as a kind of as a shell to hold everything together, and then you get a nice combination of everything. Then it's more of a 3-step process, but it makes for a pleasing mold, I think.
Yeah. Oh, and it's wicked strong. I've got epoxy molds that I stand on. I've got some that I think I could probably actually drive my car over without breaking it.
Please don't. You might break the car. That would be not good. And I guess you could do an epoxy gel coat, then plaster, and then over the top of that a couple of layers of glass.
Sure.
With epoxy.
Sure.
Would that trap the moisture? I guess that wouldn't be a problem, though.
Well, what I've started doing it a while back for molds that I'm going to be doing slush latex in, for like full head latex masks. I'll do a detail coat of Ultracal 30, maybe 3/8 of it to a half an inch of just Ultracal, and then I will back it with freeform air, because the epoxy sticks to the Ultracal just fine. So then you've got this huge one-piece mold that's easy to manipulate because it doesn't weigh like a ton. And it's got the gypsum to absorb the moisture from the latex, so the latex will cure up against the stone part of it, and you've got the strength of the epoxy and no weight to it. Granted, the latex, you fill it up with rubber, it's gonna get heavy, but it's far lighter than it would be if it was an all Ultracal mold. Because you've got to have, for it to be strong enough, it's going to be 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick.
Yeah, which is an issue, because storing that means you're going to put that, you don't want it on a shelf, or you want it in a loft space. But a nice light mold, you've got more options as to where you can put that thing. Yeah, it's a consideration, definitely. Yeah, a nice combination of stuff.
Yeah, it was a fun little chat.
I think that was pretty cool. So yeah, this needs lots of pictures. So I'll troll through and find all my. I've got most of these straps here. I will take clear images of the straps and also how they would be used, and some of my fiberglass molds. And
I'll dig up a bunch of pictures too.
Cool. And then we'll get that together in the next week or so. And then yes, if you guys have any questions, drop us an email. You can drop us an email at stuartandtodd@gmail.com.
And leave a voice message,
The next episode, I'm going to put a bunch of those together on there and catch up with that. And,
Awesome.
Thanks, man.
Good talking to you.
You too, fella. I'm going to go to bed. I'm so tired. Everything aches.
You've been a busy boy.
Thanks, man.
Talk to you soon.
You can get in touch through our Facebook page or email us at stuartandtodd@gmail.com. Check the show notes for more information. If you enjoyed this episode, tell someone else and help us grow by sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening.